Humanity's relationship to animals is one of the most consequential relationships on the planet, and yet most of us know very little about how animals are actually treated in our society or the laws that should protect them. In this documentary, we will meet leading scholars and practitioners of animal law to hear their views, and we'll also meet youth who are trying to make the world a safer and better place for animals.
You'll hear all the time people saying that they love animals. There's just animal adoration everywhere, yet there's also animal cruelty everywhere.
Yeah, so I rescued my mini pig Franny when I was 12 years old. On the side of the road, I noticed this little piglet in a rusty metal cage. She didn't have food or water, and there was a sign next to her that said free bacon. We pulled over, and immediately I rescued her. She was really thin. She was suffering from internal and external parasites, and the vet was very surprised that, she had managed to live that long in those conditions.
Our society, frankly, treats animals as quite disposable, and that even includes animals which Western society adores, like pets, because everything's an industry.
So I scooped her up and I brought her home, and I immediately realized she's the most incredible living being I've ever met. She's taught me so much. I was determined to share her story because I feel like sharing the stories of individual farmed animals shows the public how sentient they are, and they can make the connection and realize that the food on their plate had a face, had a family, had emotions, the capacity to feel pain.
The animal agriculture industry is also notorious for the mistreatment of animals, as are the zoo and aquarium industries. Basically across the board, they don't have the rights and autonomy that they deserve, really. Yeah.
I think American society is very confused when it comes to how we feel about animals and how we treat animals. On the surface, it seems like we love them and respect them, but if you even just poke at that surface, you'll see that that is just purely a surface level illusion, and there's a lot of suffering happening underneath.
But I think the biggest turning point for me was when my family got chickens when I was 9 years old, and I realized how amazing they were and that they were just as special and intelligent and unique as the dogs and cats that I had grown up with my entire life. And a little less than a year after we got the chickens, I found out about factory farming and particularly the egg industry. I just couldn't believe that chickens, just like the chickens that I loved so much at home, were going through this unimaginable cruelty. And so I went to my mom one day and I said, "Hey, can we start a chicken rescue?" My mom agreed that we could rescue 12 chickens from a local egg farm. And then we couldn't stop. And that was kind of how I initially got involved in the world of animal rights.
We need to treat animals with respect and compassion, but we also need to be their voice because they do not have a voice in Parliament otherwise and voice in our society otherwise. It becomes an opportunity, I think, for us to have the conversation of animals deserve to be treated with respect and compassion, and here's the science that they think, they feel, and they love.
Okay, so there's a fundamental problem at the heart of law. The dominant model in the world derives from Roman law, in which there are two categories. There's persons and there's things. Okay. And because the legal frameworks that are used around the world have been put in place by imperial powers, for the large part, this means that other ways of thinking about what it means to be human and what it means to be non-human have been largely erased from public discourse.
One of my areas of interest centers on the legal status of animals who have, historically been treated as mere property to be bought, sold, used for labor, traded, and slaughtered without really any legal protection securing the interest that they have as sentient beings who think, who feel, who have very complex emotional states and more.
What worries me is that when we think about animal law as a field, we tend to think of the Animal Welfare Act and the anti-cruelty statutes and wildlife protection statutes and international trade and endangered species treaties. And we tend to think of the bodies of law that are specifically expressly devoted to safeguarding animals. And we tend not to think of all the laws of animal destruction, all the laws that are actually designed to enable and support systemic abuse, maltreatment, and sacrifice of animals. Corporations law and tax law and property law and all sorts of other areas of law that we don't label animal law. That's where you would find the structures and permissions that enable systemic domination of non-human animals. And that is such a vast and powerful system of law that the marginal gains that we are able to make in the expressly animal law devoted areas, it inevitably feels we're falling short.
My passion for animal advocacy, I would say, started with dogs in shelters. I've been visiting animal shelters for as long as I can remember, to the point where adopt, don't shop just feels like common knowledge to me. So it's honestly kind of surprises me when I hear that someone has like bought a puppy or something like that. Because I mean, the numbers vary, but there's still like 1 to 3 million dogs and cats in shelters that are euthanized each year.
There's a movement lately in the legislatures to ban sales at pet stores, and there's also litigation pushing back on that, saying it's unconstitutional. So that's an area that I see as kind of a cutting edge move, which is really important due to the tremendous overpopulation.
With increasing awareness about the reality of puppy mills, hundreds of North American cities have banned retail pet stores from selling puppies. These bans often contain clauses that permit the sale of rescue dogs from shelters.
I was a legislative attorney at HSUS, the Humane Society, and I worked on really advancing laws to protect dogs and puppies in what we call puppy mills. Some countries call them puppy farms, but they're basically large breeding operations that put profits over animal well-being, and they just exist to churn out a large number of dogs that are then sold to consumers.
There's a couple of very important issues that have come to the surface during the pandemic. So one is dog breeding, and the fact that so many backyard breeders are taking advantage of people opening their homes to animals and really engaging in appalling conditions. And this in turn is highlighting the fact that breeding of animals, like many other industries, is simply not regulated in Canada. So most places, dog breeders do not need a license to set up shop. There's no limit on the animals that they can breed. There's no limit on how many litters per year they can force out of a dog. And they're often kept in very troubling conditions.
Breed-specific legislation, I've handled a fair amount of that. So discrimination based on breed and focusing on the scientific evidence, or lack of evidence, I should say, as to the inherent dangerousness or viciousness of certain breeds or breed mixes. And my view, of course, is to judge them by their behavior, no differently than people, instead of judging them by how they look on the outside, And so that's an important development in companion animal litigation.
Like the vast majority of the dogs being euthanized are also pit bulls, which is where my passion for the breed-specific legislation comes in. In 7th grade, actually, for a friend, I was fostering their pit bull, and he was like the sweetest soul I had ever met. And when I found out that pit bulls were like this demonized breed, I just could not believe it, because here was the sweetest soul I had ever met. So yeah, that was when I really started advocating for animals. 7th grade, in my English class, I did a presentation about breed-specific legislation and told Hayate's story. Hayate was the pit bull.
So the Pets Act was passed after natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina, where you had many people who did not evacuate because they could not evacuate with their pets. And as a result, sadly, many lost their lives. And a lot of these folks were in vulnerable communities to begin with. They were Black and brown. There were many economic barriers that contributed to that situation in the first place. As a result, there are opportunities now for people to go to shelters with their pets. And there are opportunities to more easily reunite with animals that are part of your household. There's no better outcome than being with the family that loves you, and no better outcome for the animal or for the families.
In high school, I was in the North Vancouver School District, and when I took the Biology 12 course, which had a massive fetal pig dissection project, which is common, I discovered that there was a lot more behind the use of animal specimens for classroom dissection, and how it is, frankly, an outdated practice that has been passed down and is used in many countries still. And so I actually pushed for the implementation of a student choice policy at the school board that I was in, and I was thrilled to see it implemented in my graduating year.
I also fought dissection and experimentation when I was a student in both my high school and my college. And then now this is back in the 80s and early 90s. So I'm so glad to hear that more and more students are doing this and doing this successfully, because it was very hard back then when I was trying. There's no reason whatsoever to be cutting open a frog or a pig or any other animal in a classroom setting like that. There are so many techniques available, these virtual programs. You can actually really see what the biology is like, whether you're talking about a pig or a frog or a dog or a human, through these virtual platforms. And they really capture the anatomy so well. I would really encourage students to not just be allowed to use these other methods, but that the instructors teach these other methods to all the students, so that more and more students end up using these virtual models instead of cutting open animals.
A place that I work with, Farm Animal Refuge, down here in Southern California, they do a lot of work with rescuing animals from animal testing or animal labs, mostly with pigs and or dogs. And they pulled 3 beagles from an animal testing lab down here in San Diego, and called me and asked if I wanted to take one of the beagles. So I took in one of the beagles. His name is Theo, and he has my whole heart. The other 2 beagles went to different homes. And one of them, Indy, he ended up passing away just a couple months after his liberation, because he just had so many physical health complications from the testing. He was getting constant seizures, was not doing well.
There's alternatives to animal testing, including alternatives that have been shown to be more effective than experimenting on these animals.
We know that 90 to 95% of drugs and vaccines that are found safe and effective in animal experimentation ends up failing in human clinical trials. And most of them fail because they're found to be unsafe or ineffective in humans, which means there is a very strong, compelling scientific and medical reason, in addition to the ethical reason in regards to how we treat animals, to move away from animal experimentation and to replace it with more effective methods.
When we use animal models to predict human responses to stimuli like drugs and diseases, we can end up with false positives and false negatives. An example of a false positive is where a drug is great for animals but ends up having adverse effects in humans. In contrast with false negatives, this is a drug that is harmful to animals and consequently doesn't make it to market, even though had we tried, it actually would have proven to be helpful to humans.
Animal testing, it's not really justified in a lot of cases because the end goal is to validate something for human use. And there are enough differences that it doesn't necessarily conclude that if something tests so-called safe for an animal, that it'll actually be safe for a human. We have differences, like for example, like organs on a chip that are being developed, and there are lots of alternatives that are better.
Actually, these human relevant testing methods are better because they're relevant to human biology. So some of the techniques that have come out over the past few years, I would say, that's really changing the dialogue are things like organ on a chip technology, and basically where you distill a major part of a human organ onto a microchip so you can really study what's happening at the molecular level, which is where everything happens. So there's a human lung on a chip, a human gut on a chip, a human mini brain on a chip, and they're all being connected, and we have the human body on a chip. So you can see how a drug may work through many of these different types of organ systems, for example.
I worked very hard trying to help shape policy that brought an end to chimpanzee research. And I also now track the remaining chimpanzees in laboratories as they move to sanctuary in the United States. The United States was the only country that was still experimenting on chimpanzees. And we, in 2015, a large group of animal rights lawyers, animal organizations, but also many people in the scientific community came together to say, okay, we shouldn't be experimenting on chimpanzees. This was a really important moment to actually preclude a certain level of research and on certain animals. And I think preventing chimpanzees from being used in research was a tremendous advance.
Globally, I'm really impressed with countrywide bans on animal testing for cosmetics, like India has banned animal testing for cosmetics. And what we see globally is that countries have stepped up to address some of the gaps that our own Animal Welfare Act has.
So just in September of 2021, the European Parliament, with just an overwhelmingly majority vote, voted to phase out animal testing in Europe.
There's a commitment to prohibit the testing of animals in relation to cosmetic testing sooner than later, and then we'll see a commitment to phase out toxicity testing on animals more broadly by 2035. We'll have a target set there consistent with the United States. So there's a lot in the short term.
The younger Americans are much more likely to disapprove of experimentation on animals. So that really shows that the culture here in the United States is definitely moving in the right direction ethically when we think about the use of animals in experimentation.
I feel that animal use in agriculture is exploitative, whether or not it's from a local family farm or it's humane, it's still exploitation. And I feel that animal agriculture is probably single-handedly the cruelest system that we have on the planet. It's a system that enables the widespread torture of non-human animals. It enables worker abuse, migrant abuse, because migrant workers are threatened with being deported if they speak up against the harmful conditions that they face while working at slaughterhouses and other animal agriculture facilities. It's a system of environmental destruction. There's no reason for us to exploit other living beings when we don't have to. That's truly what resonated with me and made me want to go vegan and speak up for animals.
There's this saying in the animal protection community that if there's one kind of animal you don't want to be born as, it's one who's being raised for food. And today, 99% of farmed animals here in the US are raised on what are referred to as factory farms, which feature these industrial scale production methods by companies concerned sort of first and foremost with their bottom lines. But, things like cheaper meat, cheaper milk and eggs come at a cost, which is paid for in animal suffering. And I think it's our laws or, lack thereof that enable that kind of treatment or mistreatment.
Over 95% of the animals that we use and kill in this country are likely used for the food supply system. The laws and usage of the animals is characterized by a lack of government oversight and regulation of their use. And instead, what the government does is it leaves it to the industry to set its own voluntary codes and guidelines that are frankly typically unenforceable and I believe used as a tool to insulate these industries from the purview of the law.
First, there's no federal law here in the US that protects animals on factory farms, and this more or less leaves their welfare up to individual states, where we see actually just this veneer of humane consideration, and that manifests, I think, in generally one of two ways. The first is that pigs, sheep, cows, and chickens are often excluded from the definition of animals under a state's general anti-cruelty code. But even if they are recognized under either a state's general or agricultural anti-cruelty laws, that statute or that law will often exempt commonly accepted animal husbandry practices.
So in Canada, a lot of people might be surprised to learn that there are no laws that govern the treatment of animals on farms. And what that means in practical terms is that things that would land you in prison for doing to a dog or a cat, for example, are perfectly not only legal, but acceptable in animal agriculture. My work examines laws that aim, I think, to keep that reality hidden, right? So ag-gag laws or agricultural gag laws. And in short, what those laws do is prevent people, activists, journalists, undercover investigators, whoever, from documenting standard practices on farms, which I think, again, most members of the public might be horrified to see, and to share that information with the public so that people can make informed choices about what they buy, what they eat, how they spend their money, what they feed their families, etc.
In addition to all of my activism and rescue work, I've recently began doing undercover investigatory work where I investigate factory farms and bring to light what is happening in these facilities. What I've seen, even just in the last year and a half of doing investigatory work, is just astounding cruelty. And the first investigation that I conducted was into a factory pig farm. The mother pigs in the gestation crates, they could barely turn around. Their pregnant bellies were protruding through the bars. They were living in their own feces and urine.
As far as our undercover investigations at Animal Justice go, we just released a undercover investigation at a organic dairy farm in BC that is run by a fairly well-respected vet, and so it was the first time that we have actually gotten footage of what is a regular practice in the dairy industry, and that is the separation of calves from their mothers within basically a few hours of their birth. This footage isn't graphic, but it is so emotionally heartbreaking to see a little calf being taken away, a mother cow who is trying so hard, is so distressed that her baby that she's carried for so many months is being ripped away from her. And we have some footage of a mother cow who is facing down the woman that's taking the calf away from her. She's like butting her and she's trying to move her away from the baby, and this woman is kicking the mother cow and flinging the calf around. And to me, it just hits the deepest part of our compassion, and that is we just understand parental bonds, we understand family, we understand babies, and to witness that, I think was, again, it has been huge. I think anybody who sees that, they can never unsee it.
And then when I went to Farm Sanctuary, I met a mother cow, and her babies had been stolen from her entire life, and she was just incredibly depressed and lethargic. But when she came to Farm Sanctuary and she was finally allowed to live out her life the way she was intended to live out her life, it was truly eye-opening to see how she blossomed as an individual. And that's what made me abstain from all animal products, was realizing that in the dairy industry, whether or not the animals are killed, they're still being exploited and abused. And so that's why I promote a plant-based diet.
The global movement to mainstreaming the non-consumption of animals is unstoppable. And indeed, one could say that the glory days of meat being equated with health and virility and nationalism, and indeed the consumption of meat with being inherently something that humans do to be human, those days are over. And I'm so grateful to have been able to see this in my lifetime.
What really inspired me to get more involved with animal advocacy was Blackfish. I remember watching the documentary and just being absolutely shocked and horrified. I think what struck me the most was just how deep and complex the experience is of the animal, of the one that is suffering. Especially being in San Diego, my parents took me to SeaWorld when I was little a couple times, and I remember seeing the orcas, and I just was amazed by their presence, their power, and I had no idea the level of suffering that they were going through.
So basically, all animals, in order to thrive, have to be able to enact what evolution prepared them for. In captivity, in tanks, dolphins and whales cannot do that. It's catastrophic for them. So the chronic stress diminishes their immune system function, and that leaves them open to opportunistic infections and high mortality rates. Their behaviors are abnormal. They exhibit stereotypies, which, as you know, are just repetitive, abnormal behaviors that animals in zoos and labs display. Hyperaggression, self-harming, depressive-like behaviors, and also disturbed social lives, difficulties with mother-infant attachment, things like that. So in short, it really is impossible for dolphins and whales who need to dive and travel and have challenges and complexities in their life to thrive in a concrete tank. And the evidence is really, at this point, pretty clear.
One of the most significant things that's happened in recent years, in my mind, is 2019 changes to the criminal code that made it a federal offense, a criminal offense, to confine whales and dolphins in captivity, to force them to perform and to breed them. So this law is designed to phase out keeping whales and dolphins in captivity entirely in Canada. And it was both one of the first serious amendments to the Criminal Code of Canada, animal cruelty provisions, in over 100 years.
Speaking of dolphins and whales, I think obviously the Canadian Senate Bill S-203 was very important. It went further than most bills of this kind do, certainly further than in the United States. And I'm really encouraged by the attention to aquatic animals in general in the law. Now, dolphins and whales, everyone is for, but we're talking about fish and invertebrates, octopus and crabs and shrimp. That's really encouraging that it's now reaching into aquatic animals of that kind.
A lot of zoos and aquariums claim to be conservation centers, and most of them are not. Most of the animals in their facilities have been taken from the wild or bred in captivity, completely not for conservation purposes, purely for profit and entertainment.
The Jane Goodall Act is incredibly important. It actually builds on the experience of the cetacean bill to say, now not only are we going to prohibit the captivity of whales, dolphins, and cetaceans, we can add other animals like great apes, for example, but we aren't going to just limit it to adding one animal at a time. We're going to create a framework where additional animals can be added going forward. And so I think it was a very thoughtful piece of legislation put together by former Senator Sinclair, and he's brilliant on any number of fronts, but including on this one. I quite like the way he talked about all our relations and just the interconnectedness between humans and animals, and it's just a really important message, I think, for so many, and drawing upon traditional indigenous teachings. the beginnings, I think, of a conversation of what standing should animals have at law? Who should be their voice, given that they are voiceless?
I think that one of the most important legal advances that we're seeing in recent years is courts and legislatures around the world evincing a much greater willingness to recognize animals as sentient beings with an inherent worth separate from their instrumental value to humans, and just more generally embracing and understanding the interconnectedness of human life with more than human.
As far as entertainment, I remember I was visiting a zoo that I'd heard was really cruel to animals. And at this zoo, there is a tiger who, as far as I know, is unfortunately still there. He was just pacing in circles around his tiny pen, this great big tiger. And he was crying these like deep, heart-wrenching cries, clearly just so depressed. And these animals should not be in captivity, and they should be out in the wild, safe and free from humans.
The other area that's of real interest to me and real concern to me is the issue of zoos and whether or not zoos around the globe, again, should be permitted to remove animals from the wild, whether there should be maybe policies and law, international law, to protect animals from being taken out of the wild, and also questions that occur in the zoo world itself, whether there's a way of thinking about zoos as more than what gets called edutainment, and instead think about zoos as possible sites of sanctuary.
So there are no federal laws that protect fur animals. I'm not aware of them existing globally either. So basically, unless they're on an endangered species list, you can gas them, you can skin them alive, you can hang them upside down, you can kill them by the millions, you can take their fur and supply the fashion industry with fur coats and pom-pom hats and fur gloves.
And then there's exotic animals, and exotic animals, at least in the United States, they're sort of like pets, but they're not the kind of ordinary pets that one would, go get at a pet store. You acquire them either through breeding, through private sales, through going to these strange exotic animal trading events. And yet it's perfectly lawful. And that's the part that I still continue to be kind of flummoxed by. Like, what is it about this liberal legal tradition to say that someone's expression of their personal freedom and their private property should include the right to have 30 tigers and bears in their backyard?
The Whale Sanctuary Project is in Nova Scotia in a big, beautiful bay called Port Hilford Bay. It's over 100 acres of water space. We'll have veterinary care, it will do education, and it will be the first sanctuary for belugas and orcas in North America and anywhere in the world, really, in terms of the amount of space that we're providing. So we want this to really be a gold standard for how we can create more sanctuaries all over the world.
The main greatest roadblocks for the advancement of animal justice and animal protection is capitalism, is white supremacy, colonialism, because these forces, they demand that we view animals as products, as commodities, as things to be owned and dominated, as things to be bought and sold. These systems force you to kind of remove your own compassion that, in my opinion, we are naturally born with for our more than human kin, and even for our human kin.
It's just our education system reduces our compassion for animals that is innate, and the world that we grow up in reinforces the ideas that most animals are deserving or don't, for some reason, need the provisions that they do. And the way that we're educated about animals also is responsible and needs to change as well.
But the idea that there is a hierarchy between where humans are at the top and animals are at the bottom, that needs to be challenged. And if that's challenged early on in education and in other ways for people, if we just start on a different assumption, I think it will be easier down the road to make some very important shifts in law and policy and other areas of animal use.
I have known animal protection law as a profession to really have been around for the last 4 decades or so, but really in the last 15 years, there's been a growth of animal law courses in law schools, for example. We have animal law journals. We have animal law sections in the state bar associations. And there's a lot of media coverage and a lot of public outreach and awareness around animal law in particular. So I am very glad to see that.
I think prior to this past decade, animal protection has been categorized as a hobby. And now it's a legit career path. And there are many opportunities for students to explore and to look forward to. There are more food companies, material companies. There's just this tangible platform for interested students. And as I said, what was once a hobby is now a profession.
So in terms of how these fields are developing, they're accelerating at a tremendous rate. In the last 10 years alone, there's been an explosion of animal law courses and policy courses offered at universities right around the world. Because of the long-standing efforts of individual lawyers and policymakers and philosophers, and then millions of individuals in their everyday choices, we're seeing then big food businesses, cosmetics companies, and then government coming on board with the rhetoric of animal welfare and animal protection, and also about working with animals in their own interests, animals as having an interest. So this has completely changed the game. It's no longer a minority discussion. If we all paid attention to what we do at home and in our backyard, in our community, that's what's going to transform, the lives of animals, which is fantastic.